This BMW was available with many different petrol engines. All of them are equipped with a turbocharger, with direct injection and with the Venus variable valve timing system, so they are pretty complex. In the before facelift cars you can find the N-series engines, and in the facelifted cars you can find the newer B-series units. Let's check out the older N-series engines first. The N13 is the weakest and maybe even the worst engine in this car. I did a separate video about all the issues it can have, so just go and check it out if you want. In short, this engine can have problems with the burned timing chain, excessive oil consumption, faulty Venus solenoids, many coolant leaks, many oil leaks, cracked turbo intake hose, and as an icing on the cake, a broken oil dipstick. Most of these issues can occur before 150,000 kilometers, but let's move on. The N20 and N26 4-cylinder engines are maybe the most common and most known in these cars. And their problems are well known as well. So, the biggest issue of these engines is related to the timing chain. Except the regular timing chain, there is also a separate chain and tensioner for the oil pump. Long story short, in cars made to 2013, they fitted a weak oil pump chain, which in a lot of cases gets worn and loose before 150,000 kilometers and sometimes even before 100,000 kilometers. If it fails, you lose oil pressure and you end up with a seized, destroyed engine. An early symptom of a worn oil pump chain is a specific whining noise from the engine. To top of that, the timing chain itself is not gonna last forever either, so be ready that mainly the engines made to 2014 are gonna have more or less worn timing chain mechanism at 150,000 kilometers or sometimes even before this mileage point. The plastic chain guides will crack and get worn as well, but that's just a minor detail. Except the oil pump chain and timing chain, you can expect other issues as well, like the electric coolant pump, which can fail before 200,000 kilometers, the plastic charge pipe on the side of the intake can crack and get loose, Venus system related issues can easily occur too, mainly the Venus adjustment sprockets can fail, and the Valvetronic actuator mounted in the middle of the cylinder head can sometimes fail too. After this there are the oil and coolant leaks. There is no time to look at them more closely, but I will mention at least the infamous plastic coolant flange bolted to the front of the engine block. It will sooner or later crack and leak coolant, so it's a good idea to replace it preventively. The 6-cylinder N55 is essentially not a bad engine, but except the oil pump chain it can have similar issues and leaks as the N20. So, this N55 also has an electric coolant pump, which can fail before 200,000 kilometers. The plastic charge pipe on the side of the intake can sometimes crack and get loose the same way as on the N20. And let's not forget about the Venus system related issues, which can easily occur too. Specifically, the Venus adjustment sprockets can fail, the two Venus solenoids located on the front of the engine can fail or get clogged up, and occasionally the Valvetronic actuator mounted in the middle of the cylinder head fails too. Last but not least, there are the inevitable oil and coolant leaks. There is no time to look at them more closely, but I will mention at least the long plastic coolant pipe which goes from the coolant tank. It will break sooner or later, causing a coolant leak, so it's a good idea to replace it preventively. And as the N20, this N55 also has a plastic coolant flange bolted to the front of the engine block. It will sooner or later crack and leak coolant, so you should replace this part preventively as well. That would be it. But before I move on to the B-series engines, let's check out the other, more generic issues related to all these N-series engines. So, since all these engines are equipped with direct injection, you should expect faulty injectors, carbon buildup on the valves, and occasionally a faulty high-pressure fuel pump. Next, all these engines have a PCV membrane mounted into the valve cover. The membrane will crack sooner or later, causing various symptoms, including a possible whistling noise like this. Then there is the turbocharger, which can of course fail, but usually not prematurely. However, there are a couple of turbo-related issues which can occur prematurely, like the wastegate rattle, electronic wastegate actuator failures, or the more famous failure of the turbo diverter valve. As an icing on the cake, let's finish this list with the rod bearings. On the N55 and on the N20 and N26 engines, rod bearing failures or simply worn rod bearings can occur, mostly after 200,000 kilometers, but sometimes even before this mileage point. If you don't catch this early, or if they fail suddenly, then you end up with a seriously damaged engine. So to minimize this issue, you should change the engine oil every 8,000 kilometers, and you should also change the oil pump solenoid valve every 100,000 kilometers. To top of that, you should also consider replacing the rod bearings preventively at around 200,000 kilometers. Now the B-series engines. The B38 is a small 1.5-liter 3-cylinder turbocharged unit. It's not the worst engine in the world, but I would rather avoid it. The most interesting issue of this engine is related to the turbocharger. Specifically, the turbo housing can crack somewhere on the inside, even before 100,000 kilometers, causing a coolant leak into the exhaust. After this, it's good to know that there are numerous cases of prematurely worn timing chains in these engines before 150,000 kilometers, like in this case, but rarely even before 100,000 kilometers, like in this case. On the other side, I have to add that in cars with regular oil changes and in cars which are used mainly for longer distances, the chain can last more than 200,000 kilometers as well. Then there are the oil and mainly coolant leaks, which are inevitable. So, the plastic oil filter housing mounted on the side of the engine can easily crack in this specific place and let all the coolant out. The water pump can leak coolant. The plastic coolant flange connected to the side of the engine block will eventually leak coolant as well, either because of the O-ring on it or because it simply cracks. The coolant tank can slightly crack too. The valve cover gasket will sooner or later leak oil. And lastly, check for oil leaks under the front part of the engine, since the front plastic crankshaft cover will sooner or later leak. The B48 and B46 4-cylinder engines don't have many specific problems yet, except the coolant leaks, which are pretty common. So, the plastic coolant pipe which goes from the coolant tank to the cylinder head often cracks and leaks even before 100,000 kilometers. The plastic oil filter housing mounted on the side of the engine can more often crack in this specific place and let all the coolant out. The water pump can leak coolant. The plastic coolant flange connected to the side of the engine block will eventually leak coolant as well, either because of the O-ring on it or because it simply cracks. And lastly, if you notice slowly disappearing coolant from the main tank, then that can be sometimes caused by the tank cap as well. Yes, of course, the valve cover gasket will sooner or later leak oil, but that's nothing special. The last engine on the list is the famous B58 6-cylinder, which has very similar problems as the B48. So except the coolant tank plastic pipe, it can have the same specific leaks as the 4-cylinder. I'm not gonna repeat them because what's the point? Now, obviously these are not all the issues the B-series engines can have. These were just the specific issues of the individual engines, so now let's check out the other problems related to all the B-series units. All these engines are equipped with a fuel tank vent valve, which is located on the top of the engine. This part can fail more often, causing mainly fluctuating revs at idle or other symptoms. Next, all these B-series engines have an innovated venous system. Even though it is innovated, you still have to expect problems mainly with the round venous solenoids on the backside of the engines. These solenoids can often fail even before 100,000 kilometers, causing various symptoms, including a strange knocking or humming, grinding noise. Additionally, the small venous central valves can get worn, causing various symptoms like limp mode or loss of power. To top of that, it's actually good to replace these small valves preventively, since they can contribute to the destruction of the adjustment sprockets, which are more expensive to replace. The last two issues are not very common, but they can sometimes occur. Cracked pistons. It can seem strange, but there are numerous cases of cracked pistons in all these B-series engines, even before 150,000 kilometers. However, before you start to panic, I have to add that this is not very common. On the other side, it can sometimes happen, and it seems like it's caused by three main things: injectors, a phenomenon called the LSPI, and performance upgrades. There is no time to dig deeper into these causes, so let's just check out the things you can do to minimize the chance of piston crack. Use only premium good quality fuel, eventually fuel additives. Have the injectors in good condition, eventually check, test, clean, or replace them preventively after 100,000 kilometers. Always pay attention to the engine misfires and fix them as soon as possible. Avoid cars with questionable performance upgrades. Change the engine oil after maximum 10,000 kilometers, but preferably every 8,000 kilometers. Use good engine oil and avoid high load at low RPM conditions. The second, not that common issue are the classic direct injection related problems. So faulty injectors, carbon buildup on the valves, and high pressure fuel pump failures. High pressure fuel pump failures are actually not common at all, but injector failures can occur and carbon buildup will appear on the intake valves. Usually the carbon buildup in these engines is not excessive, so it's enough to check and clean the valves only after 150,000 kilometers or 200,000 kilometers. On the other side, injectors can fail before 150,000 kilometers, usually causing misfires and other symptoms. There are two hybrid versions of this car. The older B4 facelift is equipped with the N55 engine and it has a hilariously worthless electric range of 4 kilometers. On the other side, the facelifted version has the B48 engine and it has a better electric range of 30 or 40 kilometers. Of course, on the used cars you should expect lower range and you should expect battery degradation too. To top of that, in both cases the electric motor is fitted into the gearbox and rarely that can fail as well. But the bigger issue is that many of the mechanics are not gonna touch these hybrid models at all, which means that for the hybrid system related repairs you will have to go to the dealer, which is gonna take all your existing and all your non-existing money. All of the petrol engines are equipped with a timing chain mechanism. In the older 4-cylinder N-series engines, it can be worn at 150,000 kilometers, rarely even earlier. On the other side, in the 6-cylinder N55 engine and in the newest B-series engines, the chain can usually last at least 200,000 kilometers, and in many cases even more than 250,000 kilometers. Except the 3-cylinder B38 engine, where it can be worn earlier.